Hi friends, in this video I'm going to take one verb and I'm going to make 48 sentences. I will take one verb and out of that I will make a sentence, and out of that sentence I'm going to make 48 sentences. How am I going to make 48 sentences? I'm going to use the tenses. What are those tenses that I'm going to use? The simple present, the simple past, the simple future, the present continuous, the past continuous, the future continuous, the present perfect, the past perfect, the future perfect, the present perfect continuous, the past perfect continuous, the future perfect continuous. In all, there are 12 tenses, and in each tense there are 4 sentences. What are those 4 sentences? The positive sentence, the negative sentence, the positive interrogative sentence, and the negative interrogative sentences. Why should we practice so many sentences? You will gain a lot of confidence to ask and answer questions in the right manner. If someone asks you, "Do you smoke?" you have to say, "Yes, I smoke." "No, I don't smoke." You can't say yes and no. Of course you can say, but you have to answer to the point. That is the correct way and the correct manner of answering and asking questions. Let's practice those sentences. In all, we are going to practice about 240 sentences. What happens when we practice 240 sentences? Your vocal cords will open. The words from your mouth will come out freely. You will improve your pronunciation, you will improve your vocabulary, and at the same time, you will observe and use the neutral accent. Let's begin with it. It's going to be a little tedious, but there is no shortcut for learning fluent English. Let's begin with narrate. N-A-R-R-A-T-E. The sentence is, they narrate stories. The 48 sentences, they narrate stories, they don't narrate stories. Do they narrate stories? Don't they narrate stories? They narrated stories, they didn't narrate stories. Did they narrate stories? Didn't they narrate stories? They will narrate stories, they won't narrate stories. Will they narrate stories? Won't they narrate stories? They are narrating stories, they aren't narrating stories. Are they narrating stories? Aren't they narrating stories? They were narrating stories, they weren't narrating stories. Were they narrating stories? Weren't they narrating stories? They will be narrating stories, they won't be narrating stories. Will they be narrating stories? Won't they be narrating stories? They have narrated stories, they haven't narrated stories. Have they narrated stories? Haven't they narrated stories? They had narrated stories, they hadn't narrated stories. Had they narrated stories? Hadn't they narrated stories? They will have narrated stories, they won't have narrated stories. Will they have narrated stories? Won't they have narrated stories? They have been narrating stories, they haven't been narrating stories. Have they been narrating stories? Haven't they been narrating stories? They had been narrating stories, they hadn't been narrating stories. Had they been narrating stories? Hadn't they been narrating stories? They will have been narrating stories, they won't have been narrating stories. Will they have been narrating stories? Won't they have been narrating stories? Let's go to the next verb. The next verb is neglect. The sentence is, the lazy neglect duties. The lazy neglect duties. The lazy don't neglect duties. Do the lazy neglect duties? Don't the lazy neglect duties? The lazy neglected duties. The lazy didn't neglect duties. Did the lazy neglect duties? Did the lazy neglect duties? The lazy will neglect duties. The lazy won't neglect duties. Will the lazy neglect duties? Won't the lazy neglect duties? The lazy are neglecting duties. The lazy aren't neglecting duties. Are the lazy neglecting duties? Aren't the lazy neglecting duties? The lazy were neglecting duties. The lazy weren't neglecting duties. Were the ladies neglecting duties? Weren't the ladies neglecting duties? The lazy will be neglecting duties. The lazy won't be neglecting duties. Will the lazy be neglecting duties? Won't the lazy be neglecting duties? The lazy have neglected duties. The lazy haven't neglected duties. Have the lazy neglected duties? Haven't the lazy neglected duties? The lazy had neglected duties. The lazy hadn't neglected duties. Had the lazy neglected duties? Hadn't the lazy neglected duties? The lazy will have neglected duties. The lazy won't have neglected duties. Will the lazy have neglected duties? Won't the lazy have neglected duties? The lazy have been neglecting duties. The lazy haven't been neglecting duties. Have the lazy been neglecting duties? Haven't the lazy been neglecting duties? The lazy had been neglecting duties. The lazy hadn't been neglecting duties. Had the lazy been neglecting duties? Hadn't the lazy been neglecting duties? The lazy will have been neglecting duties. The lazy won't have been neglecting duties. Will the lazy have been neglecting duties? Won't the lazy have been neglecting duties? Let's go to the next verb, and the next verb is notice. N-O-T-I-C-E. The sentence is he notices people. Let's make 48 sentences. He notices people. He doesn't notice people. Does he notice people? Doesn't he notice people? He noticed people. He didn't notice people. Did he notice people? Didn't he notice people? He will notice people. He won't notice people. Will he notice people? Won't he notice people? He is noticing people. He isn't noticing people. Is he noticing people? Isn't he noticing people? He was noticing people. He wasn't noticing people. Was he noticing people? Wasn't he noticing people? He will be noticing people. He won't be noticing people. Will he be noticing people? Won't he be noticing people? He has noticed people. He hasn't noticed people. Has he noticed people? Hasn't he noticed people? He had noticed people. He hadn't noticed people. Had he noticed people? Hadn't he noticed people? He will have noticed people. He won't have noticed people. Will he have noticed people? Won't he have noticed people? He has been noticing people. He hasn't been noticing people. Has he been noticing people? Hasn't he been noticing people? He had been noticing people. He hadn't been noticing people. Had he been noticing people? Hadn't he been noticing people? He will have been noticing people. He won't have been noticing people. Will he have been noticing people? Won't he have been noticing people? Let's go to the next verb. And what is that next verb? Note. Let's make a sentence out of this note. She notes addresses. She notes addresses. She doesn't note addresses. Does she note addresses? Doesn't she note addresses? She noted addresses. She didn't note addresses. Did she note addresses? Didn't she note addresses? She will note addresses. She won't note addresses. Will she note addresses? Won't she note addresses? She is noting addresses. She isn't noting addresses. Is she noting addresses? Isn't she noting addresses? She was noting addresses. She wasn't noting addresses. Was she noting addresses? Wasn't she noting addresses? She will be noting addresses. She won't be noting addresses. Will she be noting addresses? Won't she be noting addresses? She has noticed addresses. She hasn't noticed addresses. Has she noticed addresses? Hasn't she noticed addresses? She had noticed addresses. She hadn't noticed addresses. Had she noticed addresses? Hadn't she noticed addresses? She will have noticed addresses. She won't have noticed addresses. Will she have noticed addresses? Won't she have noticed addresses? She has been noticing addresses. She hasn't been noticing addresses. Has she been noting addresses? Hasn't she been noting addresses? She had been noting addresses. She hadn't been noting addresses. Had she been noting addresses? Hadn't she been noting addresses? She will have been noting addresses. She won't have been noting addresses. Will she have been noting addresses? Won't she have been noting addresses? Let's go to the next verb. The next verb is number. The sentence is we number things. 48 sentences. We number things. We don't number things. Do you number things? Don't you number things? We numbered things. We didn't number things. Did you number things? Didn't you number things? We will number things. We won't number things. Will you number things? Won't you number things? We are numbering things. We aren't numbering things. Are you numbering things? Aren't you numbering things? We were numbering things. We weren't numbering things. Were you numbering things? Weren't you numbering things? We will be numbering things. We won't be numbering things. Will you be numbering things? Won't you be numbering things? We have numbered things. We haven't numbered things. Have you numbered things? Haven't you numbered things? We had numbered things. We hadn't numbered things. Had you numbered things? Hadn't you numbered things? We will have numbered things. We won't have numbered things. Will you have numbered things? Won't you have numbered things? We have been numbering things. We haven't been numbering things. Have you been numbering things? Haven't you been numbering things? We had been numbering things. We hadn't been numbering things. Had you been numbering things? Hadn't you been numbering things? We will have been numbering things. We won't have been numbering things. Will you have been numbering things? Won't you have been numbering things? Here also we have practiced about 240 sentences. Please keep repeating after me and keep practicing as many times as possible. I want your vocal cords to open and the words to come out freely from your mouth. There is no shortcut for you to learn the correct pronunciation, the correct accent, and the correct diction and the pace when framing sentences. I wish you all the best. In my next video, I am going to add 5 more verbs and I am going to make 48 sentences from one verb. Please click the next video. Friends, you may subscribe to my channel in YouTube. To subscribe, please press here. Follow me on Twitter by clicking here. Want to follow me on Facebook? Click here to like my page.